The problem with TypeScript is that you have to recreate in your head a completely different type of computation.
In code, you define transformations of data, and TypeScript automatically defines transformations of types together with this data.
The best way to use TypeScript is when you use it everywhere. It kind of prevents you from making really stupid mistakes. Hey everyone, today we have a guest, it's Nikita Kabardin. We used to work in a lot of companies together.
And still we do.
Yes, welcome Nikita, really glad to have you on my channel. Today I want to talk about TypeScript. Recently I got a bunch of comments from different people. Basically along the lines of TypeScript is too complicated, it basically makes programming more complex and gives zero value. So today I would like to discuss the benefits of using TypeScript and why do I like TypeScript, and I use TypeScript at work, and I would probably never use JavaScript again. I don't know.
So you,
is it too bold statement?
You got some comments about TypeScript,
I got some comments about TypeScript. Do you have some comments about TypeScript?
Well, I love it. Helps me a lot.
Okay. First statement is that TypeScript is very complex. First of all, Nikita, do you agree that TypeScript is complex?
Well, it is hard to understand all of the details around TypeScript, and especially if you're getting into integrations between libraries, things like that, it will take time to get there and to get benefits. And it probably could be it could be quite a path to get, especially if you're new to typing. Like if you've never been into the typing languages, if you never coded things like C# or
other static type languages.
or like anything, like then it will be hard for you. If you, for example, switching from Ruby to JavaScript and suddenly to TypeScript, then it could be hard for you. It could be complex, yes.
I think the first thing that turns people off about TypeScript is that you have a lot more visual noise. You have all those types and you think that you need to verbosely provide the type for every value that you use. This is not true. First of all, no, TypeScript is very good at type inference. It can decide what is the correct type for a variable in a lot of situations. So if you look at my code, you will see that I don't provide the type verbosely for everything. I kind of have an intuition already where TypeScript can decide for me what is the type of the variable. And second thing is that you will get used to it. And it happens pretty quickly. I have an example, and Nikita actually can provide the same example because we both worked on Battlefield in DICE, and they used TypeScript.
We're very proud of it.
Yay!
That's really cool.
Yeah, so they used TypeScript. We used TypeScript for some parts of UI that were written in React. What was your experience with TypeScript? Was it your first position where you had to use TypeScript in your career?
Yeah, and actually it is interesting. I think it maybe was not the first one, but it was definitely the first really deep one. And also when we came to Battlefield, the process of switching from JavaScript to TypeScript was just started. And we were into this process and we helped it a lot. So we sort of learned it together with the entire team, which was like 50 developers. And that was really cool. And I think we just slowly started to understand how it helped us to just basically have a lot less bugs.
Actually, I have a question for you then.
Yeah.
You're transitioning from JavaScript to TypeScript. So you had to rewrite chunks of code base that would be integrated with JavaScript. And JavaScript doesn't have types. So did you use the type any initially?
Yeah, I think in Battlefield, exactly, there was a problem that some of the things were just really hard to type. And some of the things were not yet supported by TypeScript really well. For example, things like decorators for higher order components. And back then, we didn't really have hooks. And back then, that was a challenge, really.
Yeah, typing higher order components is a pain. I'm going to record a video about how to do this. Actually, I have a story where I joined the discussion in GitHub about TypeScript having a bug and not properly typing the hooks. Typing hooks is very complex. If possible, just don't use hooks because it will be complex. That's it.
Higher order components, hooks.
Yeah, hooks, higher order components. It's hard to type them. Anything that comes along the lines of functional programming, function composition is hard to use with TypeScript. This is just how it is. But then you were transitioning to this TypeScript language from JavaScript, and in the beginning it's fine to use any.
There is also a trick, by the way. You don't have to just use any. You can type something as any. Like, let me give you an example. Let's say you have some kind of structure which is pretty complicated and you don't yet know exactly how it looks like. It will take time for you to actually work with backend and figure it out. And you can just call it somehow like for example, backend response. And then you write type backend response equals any. And then instead of any, you use backend response. And then even though it is kind of any, so TypeScript wouldn't help you find bugs, but it will already be descriptive. And it will already be, it will already help other humans because you will use that type already, even though it will be any. And then when you will actually detail this type and add things to it, then you will see, okay, this code is actually tricky here. This code is TypeScript is telling me that it could be undefined, and step after step, this really helps you to transition.
So you're talking about providing the intent that we know that we actually kind of know what is the type here. We just didn't have time.
We know a name for it. We know what is it in real life.
We know that it's going to be this thing. We don't know what will be the form of the structure. We will do it later. For now, it's going to be any. One more thing, use unknown instead of any, because any is very kind of positive, and TypeScript doesn't check for the thing typed as any to be undefined. It always thinks that it's any in a positive sense. Maybe I'm saying complete nonsense, but as far as I remember, if you say that some attribute of the function is any, TypeScript will not tell you that, look, this thing can be undefined. Check if it exists. No. If you use unknown, then it will say, look, it's unknown, which means it can be undefined. Any is like it's anything and it always exists. Something like this. So I would do what Nikita says. So for example, you know that you get some structure from the backend. You didn't have the time or the energy to describe what will be the form of this object. Do what he said, create a type alias saying some data structure equals unknown. And it will be true, like we don't know yet what it is. We will fill this information later, and this will help your transition. You can initially use this unknown or like any, better use unknown things in the beginning, and then gradually make your types more strict. It's not that you need to switch immediately. But overall, I would suggest to not use any or even unknowns, to try to provide the actual information. It requires you to think a little bit more about the types that your functions receive. And some people might feel it like it's a burden, like they have to think more, but well, you will have to think about it eventually. And TypeScript just forces you to think about it a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and by the way, back to the complexity question, I believe that also can unveil some of the complexity that was hidden. Migrating code base to TypeScript will show you exactly which parts of the code are way too complicated, and you will be able to simplify them. And I think also sometimes by complex, people just mean descriptive.
Yes.
Like it's too much code, then it's complex. I think that it's like a well-described 200 lines of code for me is actually easier and simpler than 25 lines of a very hardcore, like, I don't know, regex based, like crazy stuff that just is not typed at all. Like some people would say that the shorter is simpler, but for me, the more lines, the more stupid the code is, the better. Yeah, sure. One thing that people might not like is that TypeScript limits your ability to be creative, like a creative in a bad sense, in a way. Like sometimes programmers just love to express themselves through code, and I would honestly do that maybe in the first 5 years of my career, maybe 7 years of my career, and it's a common thing to do because we love it. We love doing code. That's why we also sort of connect our need to code with our need to express our creative ideas. Sometimes we just write the code a certain way without admitting that we are doing it because we like how it looks like, not because it's needed.
So TypeScript restricts you a little bit, and actually it reduces the complexity that you can allow. But back to the complexity thing, is that there are different kinds of complexity. What you said about the thing, like component or function that is 200 lines of code, it is not necessarily complex. So one complexity is the business requirements complexity. The reality that you're encoding, the business requirements that you're encoding can be complex. This is unavoidable. Like, yes, if we're doing complex thing, the code for it is also going to be complex. Another kind of complexity,
and that's fine.
Yes, and it's fine. It's just the reality of things. Sometimes
don't try to simplify things that are hard in real world.
Yes, it's just it's impossible. Another kind of complexity is that the complexity that comes from indirectness. So when you, for example, use Redux, Part of the complexity that it brings is the complexity of being indirect. So instead of saying, when I press this button, I change this piece of state. No, you don't change this piece of state. You shoot an action, you dispatch an action that will come to the reducer, and this reducer will perform some calculations, and this will update the state. This is indirectness complexity. This is avoidable, and it depends on the size of your code
base. By removing Redux.
No, I think sometimes it's a legit decision. Sometimes some code bases benefit from using Redux because they have some sort of specifics that makes it.
Or some critical parts with, let's say, payments, for example, could be.
Yes. And then there is another kind of complexity that is, I want to say stupid, but okay, let's say, I think that the third kind of complexity is stupid. This is self-imposed complexity. When you read TypeScript documentation and you see all those advanced utility types, you have all those like complex generics. And the thing is, you don't need to use all the features. And a lot of times you might think, oh, it's so powerful. I'm going to write some generic function that will cover all the cases. My advice, and I think Nikita will agree, don't do it. Write stupidly simple code, because at some point you will be tired. At some point you will be busy with an overwhelming amount of other tasks, and you will have to go back to that code, and you will hate yourself for overly complexifying things, making them too generic, and actually not solving exactly the problem that you have at hand, but trying to solve the problem in general.
Yeah.
Well, it might not be needed. Do you remember that example when you were coding, what was it, server connection screen for Battlefield, and you had it?
Like correctly? A server browser,
yes.
Server selector.
And there were a bunch of pages that were like very, very similar, but they were not exactly the same thing. It was actually different entities that looked similar. You get this desire of like, oh, they're so similar. I'm going to make one thing that will cover all of them.
Yeah, for example, we wrote basically the same UI for Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 4. So the instinct is to, okay, let's reuse the same thing for two games. Well, those are games from different eras. There is no problem to have a little bit of copied code, because in some cases you just want to, stop updating BF4 and keep updating BF1. Even though the name is BF1, it actually got released a few years later. I really think that if you can avoid dry but make things simpler, then go for it.
A lot of times it's just hard to predict if the things are going to be updated independently. And I would wait until I really know that this thing is more comfortable to be used as one thing with parameters.
Yeah,
a lot of times just repeat yourself.
And I would say that my current rule of thumb after so many years in industry is to just don't unify until you're absolutely certain that it will be used 3 and more times in absolutely similar situations.
I would give similar advice. I would just remove the numbers from it. I would say, wait until you suffer from having to change a bunch of places at once. When you see that, okay, this is now a burden, then fix it. Until it's a problem, whatever. But we actually derailed from the TypeScript conversation. So the thing is that for you, you said it was the second project or not the first one where you used TypeScript?
As far as I remember, it was maybe the first one in TypeScript, actually.
For me, it was definitely the first one. And thing is that I had to join a huge code base that I had no idea about. And it was really, really, really huge, really big code base with a bunch of products that are kind of related. Some parts were reused, some not. There were a bunch of different kinds of data from different sources, from the backend, from the game client, from the game itself that provided the data for the UI. And I don't think I would be able to begin to contribute as quickly if it would be written in JavaScript. I would just have to learn what are the types, what kinds of data are we shooting around.
Yeah, you're just afraid. The project is way too big.
That's one thing.
Way too important to you try to. And also one thing that we didn't actually have a pull requests, so no one would be reviewing your code. Yeah,
it was very dangerous kind of coding. Like you push to master, and then if you block the whole team, and you block actually not one team, but all the teams in the company.
Essentially, a lot of them, yeah.
A lot of all the front-end teams, basically, because they can't push because the master is broken. But it's the topic for another video.
Yeah.
About the TypeScript, that first of all, it gives you the right restrictions. It kind of prevents you from making really stupid mistakes. So, for example, not thinking about some data not existing. What if you didn't get it from the backend? And cool thing that you can share the types between different parts of the systems. And this is where TypeScript actually shines. Mm-hmm. For example, you can have backend written in Java or Scala or whatever other typed language, you can generate the open API spec, and from the spec you can generate TypeScripts, and then TypeScript types, and then you can use those types in your client, and you can be sure that if you receive some data from the backend, it will have this exact form because this type was generated by the backend, and you didn't have to like, oh, what kind of fields do I get there? You know it, and also you can just look at them. TypeScript serves as documentation. You know exactly what are you getting from your backend if you do it properly and you invest in connecting the types between backend and frontend.
Again, that's not easy. That's an investment, and that's a complexity.
Yeah, that's an investment.
That's a complexity. But that's a useful complexity. Very useful complexity.
So I would say that what I'm 100% certain about is that if the project is big and a lot of developers work on it, TypeScript will definitely benefit the team. Eventually. Maybe in the beginning it's going to be hard. It's an investment again, but then there will be a benefit. What about small projects?
Well, I would say don't go for it initially, except for the cases when you need to learn TypeScript, and that's your goal. Like if it's really small project, you might be well off without TypeScript, or you can be partially TypeScript. Like TypeScript doesn't force you to actually have all the types ready. You can type part of your app.
I agree with you with your first part of your sentence, is that if you use TypeScript, if you try to use TypeScript in your small pet project, only for the reason of TypeScript being popular and that's the right way to write front-end application or back-end or whatever, that's not the right reason. You're just suffering for no good reason. That's it. Eventually, after you work enough with TypeScript, it will become easier for you to use TypeScript instead of JavaScript. Now, even for my small pet projects, I use TypeScript because now there is no friction for me.
No overhead.
Eventually, it will go away. A lot of friction eventually goes away. You get intuition about how things work. You get a habit of thinking of what types does your function receive, or what kind of things can it process. What was the second thing that you said? You can partially type your application. I don't agree. I think the best way to use TypeScript is when you use it everywhere. So this transitioning step is fine. It's okay. But you need to strive to accommodate it completely. That's another video that I'm going to record about TypeScript settings. And there is this setting called strict mode. And I would definitely advocate for enabling it so that you don't use any's and use at least unknowns, and if possible, sometimes the data is unknown, and it's true that it's unknown. A lot of times you actually know the type, and you actually just need to invest some time and describe what are you getting there.
But if it's unknown, that means that you could still write a code that relies on that being unknown. So secure code that checks it and double checks it and triple checks what's inside and then does things. I agree that in general case, I would also use strict mode, and I would advocate for it having it's everywhere. But maybe if you're doing a first project and maybe you're just switching from JavaScript to TypeScript, you still could benefit from TypeScript even if you use some any's and if it's not very too strict, especially if you're working alone, and especially if that would be a breaking point for you. Like either you implement it and succeed or not. And if you are going for everything perfect, then and that will limit you from succeeding, then I would say just use the raw JavaScript, and then once you transition, that's a thing. Like while you're transitioning to TypeScript from some existing code base in JavaScript, I think that enabling strict mode right away is not a good idea.
Not right away, it will be too much work. Imagine you have a JavaScript project and then you enable it and then you have 100, 200, several hundred errors, and you feel discouraged.
If you just take a regular JavaScript code base and you switch to TypeScript, it will be a valid TypeScript because it's valid until you have any types. You just don't have any types, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that was the example of how you transitioned in Battlefield project. Mm-hmm. First it was JavaScript, and then gradually implementing the types, and sometimes just having them as any, just having a type alias for them.
And by the way, in there we had a very nice practice because the migration process is such a long process. It's huge code base and many people. So we had a bot that basically on each build in master calculated how many any's we have and what is the percentage of TypeScript files and JavaScript files. So we always had metrics. Okay, half of project is already in TypeScript, but we have let's say 250 any's. And each time you push a commit that removes one any, you sort of get like a notification in Slack that, okay, this person just removed an any. So that's a gamification of this very hard and long process. And I think it took many months until we actually finished.
Less than a year. That's what I was going to say. That
it's a long time.
You joined a year before me to the company? I think so.
I don't think so. I think it's less.
Less than a year. So what I was going to say, that when I joined, the whole project was already in TypeScript. So even as it was a huge code base, they managed to transition to TypeScript fully. I don't remember too many any's there. I think it was like super legit. It was quite
maybe you joined like 3 months later, and maybe when I started, they anyway, whatever.
So the thing is that
history.
This transition, even though it might feel overwhelming in the beginning, it will end eventually. Like here's the example, right? Several months of tracking, and actually making a continuous effort of transitioning to TypeScript and having more descriptive types, it works, and eventually you will be done with it. I would like to discuss one final thing, and it's that a lot of people struggle with types. You know, that instead of just solving the problem, they fight with the compiler, they fight with TypeScript, making sure that those type definitions actually
trying
match.
To fix the compiler instead of trying to fix the...
Yeah. Do you have any advice to those people? Because for me, it's hard now because I don't remember myself for past several years fighting with TypeScript, except for a few cases, for example, with very complex generic types, like when you type a hardware component. But it's very rare task. Usually it's quite basic, to be fair.
For those who don't know, generic types are types with type parameters.
Exactly. Type arguments that are sort of dynamic to a certain extent. They are calculated when you use the function. So you can say that the function receives some argument, whatever the type. You can specify the limitations that it extends another type, it resembles some other type. And then when you call this function, right there in the code, the TypeScript will decide that this generic type here is, let's say, string or number or whatever, and use the actual type instead of the generic. But
this allows a lot of powerful stuff. But anyway, what was the advice on?
People fighting with the compiler, trying to make the types work instead of solving the problem. Do you have an advice for this?
Well, people? I would say in this case might be that you need to sort of learn a little bit of a theory of typing in general. That will help you in many languages, not only the TypeScript.
Oh, really?
There is sure, you can go really deep into Haskell and things like that and category theory, but it's good to know that types did not come to our existence with TypeScript. They existed in many languages, and the theory behind them is sort of the same. And you can just get into that world and try to learn overall the theory of types. That's one way. If you are, for example, really into computer science and that's your approach. If you're not so much into computer science, and for example you don't have a degree like we don't, then maybe that's a hard path for you, and you should probably instead take a more practical path of learning.
Easy solution. Do you have an easy solution?
There is no easy solution. I don't think do you have an easy solution?
I think so. I will make a guess. What is the problem for those people here?
Mm-hmm.
I think that the problem with TypeScript is that you have to recreate in your head a completely different type of computation. So when you work with the runtime, you kind of execute, when we work with the code, we try to execute the program in our head. And even when you work with JavaScript, the only layer of execution is that, okay, we call this function, then this data comes into this variable, and then you kind of model it in your head what happens. And TypeScript imposes a completely different thing. And you often, in the beginning, when you're not used to it, you will think about it as it will be happening in the runtime. And you would often think, how does TypeScript not know what the type is here? Because why is it complaining? Because at runtime, this value would already be known. But when it's computing things during the compilation step, this is really unknown. So just, I think it's also not an easy solution, but you have to get used to this second kind of computation that is very different, and it takes time to get used to it and create this emulation code reading machine in your head.
Yeah, basically there are types that you define in TypeScript, and usually those are like arguments of the function, and the return type of the function are the typical ones you're most likely going to define. You rarely define a type of variable. Usually it sort of inherits from what you assign first, right? If you're using const, for example, and TypeScript is smart enough, and here it might be, and also TypeScript is smart with many other things. For example, it supports natively things like map, reduce, and other functions like in arrays. It's really, really smart in some of the cases. It tries to be smart and tries to resolve things which you didn't define. And you should try to think of each line of code as typed line, even though some of them are typed implicitly, automatically, by TypeScript, not by you. And that's something to get used to, and I guess your way of sort of reading it and thinking of types on each step is a way to go. And also type transitions, type transformations is also a thing that TypeScript does automatically for you.
Did you ever have to do this?
Exactly. You don't have to do it, but the TypeScript is doing that automatically. For example, you have a const with an object which has two keys, A and B. And then on the next line, you're creating a new variable which using 3 dots notation of rest spread, you add also another key to that.
And you change the type.
Exactly. You didn't do it yourself. You didn't write a type, but automatically this new variable has a new type already, because TypeScript is smart enough to understand what happened and what is the new type. So in code, you define a transformations of data, and TypeScript automatically defines transformations of types together with this data. And you should think of that and try to understand this logic behind TypeScript. Sometimes you have to write things and, tell TypeScript that this parameter should be this, but it's not only thing that TypeScript does.
Another advice, develop an intuition. And to develop an intuition, play around with types with very simple examples, like what Nikita just said. Try it out. Create an object, try to add another field, and check the type of this new value that you received.
Yeah, in decent IDE, decent editor, you would just move mouse on top of this variable and see the new type eventually.
If you use type and not interface. I almost always use types, to be honest, exactly for this reason.
No, what I mean is that if you just added something with object rest spread and you have another type, new variable, you can hover over with like shift or how is it done?
I think by default now it's just you hover it over, or if you use Vim bindings for VS Code like I do, you press GH and it shows that thing as well. But another thing that I realized is that...
pretty sure in Emacs you can do it as well somehow. Maybe like you just put fingers like this and it's done.
Stop mocking Emacs.
All right, yeah, Emacs is great. it has everything for you.
I think the problem is that TypeScript and React support in Emacs is actually quite poor. A lot of people, not a lot, some people use it and some people say, oh, but we have this package. I tried it. It doesn't support it as well. And that's a different topic. What I wanted to say is that I realized that I don't actually know what people are struggling with when they say that they're like fighting with a compiler. So if you had this problem, then join my Discord server. The link will be in the description, and send me an example, the code that you're struggling with, and maybe I will review it during the video and see how can I help, how would I approach this thing. I would like to learn more about people who struggle with TypeScript. So you help me, you tell me your problems, I help you, and everyone benefits.
Yeah, smash a like button. Oh, it's your channel, you should do it.
Do whatever. You can smash like button, you can smash subscribe button, you can smash the
bell.
This thing.
This channel, by the way, has a lot of good streams.
Yeah, now I'm actually streaming every Tuesday. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's super good, sometimes it's bad, and I remove the stream afterwards. But it's fun. It's always fun. And recently I started streaming with my Discord audience, so people can join through the voice channel, and we actually just chat and have really good times. I love it. It's so awesome. That was the best thing that I did. I actually stole this format from Eddie Jaude, who has Eddie Radio. Fantastic format. Really allows you to connect. A lot of fun. Super cool. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Nikita, for coming to my channel. That was amazing. Hope to see you again sometime and discuss other stuff.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.